welcome everyone. My name is Kerry Roberts and I'm presenting the Strategic Studies Department here at JSOU. Today we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker including audience Q&A. The session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Please keep in mind the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily represent the views, opinions, or policy of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, or U.S. Special Operations Command. If you have questions after this session, please email thinkjsou@socom.mil as indicated on the slide. Since unsettled weather is always a possibility, if you lose connection, just rejoin the session. If the internet fails you, you can always dial in with the phone numbers on your registration confirmation email. Today's moderator is Mr. Kyle Garland, outreach faculty here in the Strategic Studies Department at JSOU. He will introduce the program and today's guest.
Thank you very much, Kerry. Hello and good day to everyone. My name is Kyle Garland and I'm from the Joint Special Operations University located in Tampa, Florida. I want to welcome everyone to another online interview of Think JSOU. Think JSOU is an ongoing series that explores research and publications of JSOU faculty, resident senior fellows, leading academics, and the wider SOF and international security community. The online collection includes interviews and conversations with authors and researchers and is intended to supplement existing publications, articles, and other active discussions. I encourage everyone to explore the complete Think JSOU collection by reviewing our online offerings posted to the All Partner Access Network, or APAND, and also available for streaming through our library and the JSOU social media sites. Today we are honored to have Dr. James D. Kairos join us for a conversation on SOF capabilities and great power competition. Dr. Kairos is a professor of military and strategic studies at the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies, or SAS, and also an adjunct professor of defense and strategic studies at Missouri State University. With over 25 years experience in academia and defense policy, he is a recognized expert on irregular warfare, including special operations and suicide bombings. Dr. Kairos' first book, entitled Special Operations and Strategy from World War II to the War on Terrorism, was published in 2006. He also co-authored Understanding Modern Warfare, published in 2016. For our online attendees, if you have a question for our guest today, please submit the question using the Q&A icon on your toolbar. Professor Kairos, thanks very much for joining us today.
Kyle and Kerry, thank you so much, and thanks so much to JSOU for hosting this.
Well, we're really glad to have you, and I appreciate the time. Sir, as I previously stated, today we're going to talk about SOF capabilities in great power competition, or GPC. I'm sure most of our audience understands that GPC is enshrined in our 2017 National Security Strategy, as well as our 2018 National Defense Strategy documents. So, Professor Kairos, I usually like to start with a rather big picture question. So will you please begin with a brief description or the definition of GPC and how this is different than our more recent national security strategies?
Sure thing, Kyle. So when I was thinking about the question of GPC, it's been on the minds of so many in the defense community, particularly after the release of the NSS and the NDS. And one of the big challenges is really everyone trying to understand what the scope and boundaries of competition actually are. If I could conclusively define what great power competition is, I certainly wouldn't be living in Alabama right now, but I'd rather be the king of K Street in Washington. One of the things I was also thinking about as we were discussing the topic here is that this JSOU webinar may have the shortest shelf life of any in the Think JSOU series, because as many of us know, sometimes policy changes relatively quickly after an election, and then certainly when a new administration takes office. So this discussion may be OBE in another 6 months. We'll have to wait and see about that. On a more serious note, what I would say is that the initial problem is the scope of competition, and that scope existing in the eyes of pretty much each and every beholder. And what I mean by this is great power competition is really not clearly defined in the national security strategy or the national defense strategy. So what's occurred is that combatant commands, departments, and agencies have taken an action which includes trying to establish the boundaries for themselves, and in doing so, in the process, scoping it either much too broadly or much too narrowly. And let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here. For example, a recent joint doctrinal note defined the continuum of competitive activities, which looks an awful lot like what we traditionally understood as the range of military operations, or ROMO, or as some have interpreted as more traditional statecraft and state behavior. Another document defined competition in terms that SOCOM and a SOF audience will be much more familiar with from a few years ago. All of those activities that are short of war or competitive gray zone activities. Competition really comprises three elements when it relates to great powers: cooperation, competition, and conflict. And as each has tried to bound that problem set, what they've tended to do is focus on the one that most reflects either their institutional proclivities, their capabilities, and also their preparations. So the armed services, for example, tend to view competition largely in terms of conflict or preparation for domain-driven concerns. So for example, the United States Navy and the Air Force focus largely on China and are Pacific focused, whereas the Army is much more Russia focused. US SOCOM, for its part, has tended to look at great power competition as sort of the net sum of all of its ongoing daily activities to a large degree. Competition in a broader sense rests on a different foundation, which really is an acknowledgement of the shift from a unipolar international order to one that's likely returning to more of a balance of power situation between great powers. And really, even though it names 4 powers, it's really talking about 2, which is China and Russia. In more specific terms, the NSS and the National Defense Strategy mark a shift in primacy away from a liberal institutional order, which means working largely through regional, international, supranational organizations such as the UN and the WHO and others, to something that the NSS and NDS call principled realism, or putting American interests first. We still need partners, but what we're going to do is ensure that American interests and concerns are met first and foremost. In more general terms, and even broader terms than what I've just discussed, the NSS and the NDS for great power competition are really marking a shift away from an interconnected set of global concerns, such as climate change and terrorism and the like, with an emphasis on a range of more general capabilities to deal with them, and moving away from that more to specifically identified and to a degree prioritized threats. If I was to sort of summarize it, it would be moving away from an approach to risk management of ongoing crises to a much more sort of long-term threat-based focus. So there's 2 elements there. You know, one is just a time horizon, and 2 is a prioritization.
Okay, well, thank you. Before we actually dive into what the US SOCOM and SOF capabilities can be in this new strategy, I want to ask you one more question about the strategy in general. Mm-hmm. So as I mentioned in your bio, you have many years in the defense strategy teaching it. So as a policy expert then, and of course this is your opinion, but do you believe that this shift in strategy to GPC and away from counterterrorism, as you just mentioned, is the right direction for our country at this time?
Well, of course, as an academic, I'm going to take issue and quibble with a couple of the terms. But what I would say is I don't necessarily agree with the term the right direction. What I would say is that move was rather necessary instead. And when I say necessary, I say that it was a necessary move or necessary shift for 3 primary reasons. The first is just sort of provoking or kicking all of the machinery of government into response and alignment. Some of us might recall, I know many of the folks in the audience definitely will, that the Obama administration tried to mark a shift away with its so-called pivot from a focus on the Middle East to Asia, And DoD tried to do the same under the same administration with its offset strategy approach. By making GPC the centerpiece of both the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, and then going the extra step, the unprecedented step more recently of producing substantial classified versions of each, this really kind of forced the machinery of government to sit up and take notice that there was a major policy shift. The second is a general dissatisfaction with a largely reactive approach to sub-state threats. And when I say a general dissatisfaction, I mean in the policy community writ large. So put simply, in policy terms, there's been a level of fatigue that's set in fighting what some have classified as forever wars against insurgents or terrorists, and really a lack of focus or purpose beyond anything beyond sort of maintaining the status quo. We've seen variations of this theme come out in some of the other Think JSOU series webinar discussions. The one I'm thinking primarily was with John Lewis Gaddis. And what they're really lamenting here is a lack of a grand strategy for the United States, kind of a rudderless or directionless. So great power competition signaled in the minds of some a return to a grand strategic focus as opposed to chasing after tactical problem sets. The third reason that I would offer is that it's necessarily connected to the previous two. And what I mean by that is, in simple expenditure terms, the costs of continued counterterrorism at the level we've been doing it for the past 15 years is seen by many to be unsustainable. In other words, some look and say, we really haven't seen the return on the investment. And there was also no forcing function to scale back all of the bureaucratic focus, the bureaucratic sort of processes that were focused on the counterterrorism enterprise. So there's a realization here that while the US still has a technological advantage over its great power competitors, it's a recognition that that gap has really closed at such a rate as to cause considerable concern. And in addition, while the United States was engaging in partnerships and alliances to some degree of convenience to address terrorist and other irregular threats, Russia and China were greatly expanding their influence, and I'll emphasize in political and economic terms, and then also, to a lesser degree in military terms, particularly in Asia, the stands, and Africa. And so a primary concern here is that we had always had a level of technological dominance, and increasingly the People's Republic of China is gaining a level of technical parity and numbers that cuts to the heart of a real problem for the American defense enterprise, which is we have relied on our technical superiority to overcome numbers for really more than 30 years.
Yeah. Well, so now that we've talked about the strategy a little bit, let's talk about USOCOM's role in the strategy. And before we talk about the nuts and bolts, but I'd like to ask you, how does SOCOM need to think? Because that's what we're trying to do now. We're trying to get the conversation out on how we think about this. But how does SOCOM need to think about GPC in order to effectively apply special operations?
Well, in some respects, I'd say SOCOM's already doing some of the right things, but it can improve on some others. And so what do I mean by the former? I would say that SOCOM and some of its components are really signaling to the armed services and others that they're embracing the great power competition in sort of the proper way, and marking a shift away from a focus on violent extremist organizations to the challenges associated with state-based competitors. Two examples that I'll offer of this was the USOC Army SOF strategy that was released in 2019, as well as AFSOC strategic guidance that was just released here in 2020 in this year. Both of those documents are suggesting really a 5 to 10 year shift in organizing, training, and equipping to meet these challenges. And so somewhere between 2025 and 2028, both USOC and AFSOC believe that their forces will have the knowledge, skills, and abilities to play a major role in potential conflict against a great power opponent. I'd also argue that some of the recent crisis responses in which SOF was involved, at least the planning for those crisis responses, revealed some atrophied muscles related to dealing with great power threats or near peer threats. And I would say some of those atrophied muscles include the most lethal ones between the ears, to paraphrase former Secretary Mattis, in response to some regional threats. And these really kind of served as a wake-up call in some quarters, that we had not focused on these problem sets sufficiently for a period of time to be able to marshal sufficient capabilities to be able to address them. So there are a number of other conceptual challenges related to GPC. So that's the good news. There are others that I think SOCOM really needs to consider. And I would say that the primary one for the command is really kind of wrestling with the question and identifying what force of choice that it should be for the nation over the longer term. The reason I say that is, to my mind, SOF really can't be optimized for both irregular and great power threats at the same time. So, if US SOCOM is committed to GPC, and what I mean by that is, sort of great power conflict in the most dangerous but least likely long-term scenario, it's going to require a rather graceful withdrawal from being the force of choice for irregular threats, and really kind of communicating that move and shift to policymakers and identifying it as a potential area of future risk. I would also say that the real difficulty is going to be for SOCOM to transition processes, programs, and indeed some of its bureaucratic culture that is really kind of focused so much on ongoing and continuing crises, and really sort of look and plan much more for the longer term. And really that longer term look also means making very meaningful forecasts of what the future GPC threat environment is going to look like, and the employment scenarios for SOF, so that it can then modify, alter, or acquire new capabilities in the process.
So thank you. Now I want to get a little bit more specific. In May of this year, Lieutenant General retired Thomas Trask co-authored an article stating that a proposed decline in the US SOCOM budget is based on the theory that SOCOM really does not have much of a role in GPC. Now, of course, he attempted to rebuff that theory in his article. So now let's use Russia first. Using Russia as our first case, how can US SOCOM and SOF contribute to the great power strategy?
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. Before I state my response to that question, I'll just say, I'm familiar with the Trask article. I have a few issues with the straw man argument that the authors of it employ, but I completely understand their rationale for doing so. In the case of Russia specifically, there are really, I think, several ways that SOCOM and SOF can contribute, and one I don't think immediately comes to mind. The one that I'll highlight here is really kind of to try to preserve the myth and mystique surrounding American SOF. American SOF still are still the gold standard, as it were, globally for a SOF enterprise. And the irony is that although those of us who are familiar, or those of us who live inside the processes, we can routinely kind of see the seams and gaps in our actions and our authorities and our processes, because we live and breathe them each and every day. The irony is that because of how the Russians view American SOF, they attribute a considerable level of integration jointly, as well as at the interagency level. So, the funny thing is, while we have a steering document from the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, who's really looking at capability integration and all domain options, the funny thing is the Russians believe we're already doing this. And not only have we already been doing this, we've been doing this since 1991. So they're looking at our activities and SOF role in it, and saying that this is really the character of contemporary warfare, that the United States uses its diplomatic, informational, military, and economic means, and SOF is a portion of that, in a very coordinated manner to influence, isolate, and replace regimes. So while actions speak louder than words, I think one thing we can do that's relatively low cost is produce kind of more focused, publicly available writings on how SOF can contribute specifically to countering or conducting irregular warfare in Russian areas of activities, and highlighting some Russian vulnerabilities in the process, which would help reinforce this belief. And so, although one of the taglines that I mentioned previously of both the National Defense Strategy and the National Security Strategy is America First, that doesn't mean that we're not helping our partners, or that we're no longer going to help our partners, coalition members, or we're going to abandon our alliances. So one of the things that SOF can and should be doing, specifically related to Russia, is continue to engage with those alliances, partners, and coalitions in the sorts of exercises like Trojan Footprint, or the one that we conducted in Lithuania called Flaming Sword, really kind of an unconventional warfare exercise. In addition to that, we can continue to conduct regional symposia, such as the SOF Resistance Workshop that was sponsored by SOCIR and Usocom, and that led to the development and the producing of a SOF resistance concept. So these sorts of exercises, symposia, and concept development can serve a very useful purpose in reassuring allies, giving us all sort of a better collective understanding of their concerns and perspectives, provided we listen to them, as well as providing a common frame of reference functionally, and in addition to sort of improving our partners' capabilities to address the Russia threat that is much closer to them.
Yeah. Well, we're getting a couple of really good questions about China and Russia, but before I get to those, I want to ask you the same question as it applies to China. And the question is, how can Usocom and SOF contribute to the great power strategy as it applies to China?
So yeah, great related question. And I would argue that really much the same as what we're doing in a general sense with Russia, but the question here is a difference in emphasis, I would say. In Asia in general, the United States has a fairly strong presence in terms of forward basing, but lacks the sort of well-defined integrated alliance structure that we have, as well as some of the incentives and enticements that we have in Europe. So, and in addition, recognizing that our Asian partners, save for a few, have a very different outlook on special operations forces and special operations generally. A number of them have much more of a focus on internal threats and have very different perceptions of the China threat than we do. So while we can continue to conduct exercises in regional engagement, and it will be valuable, they arguably won't have the same impact as they do in Europe, at least until China takes more aggressive actions, and those partners see that threat in the same sort of light that we do. If SOF are going to act as global scouts for GPC, then Usocom can also provide a useful role in better understanding Chinese activities regionally and globally, as well as grasp the elusive and rather frequently changing perceptions locally of such activities. But you know, those SOF activities will largely, I think, be constrained to a supporting role to American diplomacy and the intelligence community.
Okay.
I'll also add, if you don't mind, if we've got a minute, in terms of preparing for potential conflict, SOCOM and SOF should do in the Pacific for conventional forces what they're doing with partner SOF in Europe, which is really kind of understanding the concerns and problems conventional forces face, as well as providing options and alternatives to assist in what's really within the realm of the possible in terms of special operations, to help those conventional forces solve the very wicked problems in the Pacific theater that are associated with area denial, basing, striking or holding at risk those crucial elements of the enemy system that they are striving to build right now.
Well, since we're talking about China and Russia, I'd like to take two questions from our online members. And the first one reads, last week, Dr. Liam Collins made the point that we are more in a state of conflict with China and Russia and not in a state of competition. He believed that legitimate competition is based on following rules and laws, whereas conflict does not. What are your thoughts on that perspective?
So a colleague of mine at Air University has written a wonderful book called Pure Strategy. And most folks love the tagline, which is pure strategy is really all about seeking and maintaining a competitive advantage. But they tend to forget one element or aspect that's associated with that. One of the reasons that China and Russia are operating in the ways that they are is in reaction to American dominance of both the legal structures, the legal frameworks that exist internationally, as well as shaping and maintaining those norms. There's an interesting contrast for China. It wants to be seen globally as playing by the rules, but sees its ambitions and aspirations increasingly thwarted by American dominance and manipulation of international laws and norms. One example was taking some of its island building claims to the World Court and having, in essence, those claims struck down. And again, in Chinese perceptions, that's largely because the Americans continue to dominate the system for their advantage. So the irony is, in looking at conflict or competition, we see it as competition because we are in the preeminent position. They're looking at competition as how is it that we are able to manipulate the rules in some of the same ways that the United States has been able to do to maintain its dominance over the last 20 years or so.
Thanks. Now, this question is also from an online member, and it's right on point here. You've addressed it a little bit when we talked separately about Russia and China, but the question reads, as you consider the differences in approaches between China and Russia, how do you see potential differences in the application of SOF toward each threat?
That's a great question, a very interesting question. So much of this is going to be shaped by two things. The first is really the geographic realities within each theater of operation. One largely being continental in focus, and the other much more largely, at least from our perspective, maritime in focus. The reality for both though, in geopolitical terms, is that the heartland that exists that's sort of at the center between Russia and China is one of those areas that is incredibly difficult for us to really kind of conceptualize how we might exploit that, or how we might be able to take advantage of that. And what that's going to, I think, substantially require is both a very different approach in terms of capabilities, both in terms of mobility to get there, in terms of sustainment, in terms of footprint and profile, in terms of their resilience. But again, the geographic realities are one set of considerations that are going to drive capabilities in one respect. Just trying to overcome the tyranny of distance that exists in the Pacific. And then, where does one base in a different range of in a different range of island chains is really the preeminent problem in the Pacific. Whereas, the issue that we're dealing with in Western Europe Eastern Europe is really trying to figure out how we can prevent Russian actions from accomplishing fait accomplis like they were able to do in Ukraine and in the Crimea specifically in 2014 and 2015. The challenge, arguably for both, is the speed of response and the ability to kind of sense both Russian and Chinese activity. So there are some similarities, but those similarities are also influenced to a large degree by the geographic and geopolitical realities as they exist in both theaters.
Yeah, absolutely. So Professor, now that you've discussed how SOCOM can contribute, I'd like to ask you, in your opinion, what must USOCOM do as an organization to make this happen, if really anything?
So it's at this point that the Strategic Studies Department may reconsider my senior fellowship at JSOU when I offer some helpful, friendly advice. But what I would suggest is, the first and foremost question to my mind for SOCOM is really conducting a realistic assessment of what special operations are going to be both in the mid and the long term. And what I mean by that is not the points that I've already raised a little bit earlier, but an assessment that really kind of takes a hard-nosed look at roles and missions, capabilities, and authorities. And to come back to something that I said a little bit earlier, that sort of assessment will try to answer the question of what force of choice SOCOM is going to be for the mid and the long term. And it cannot be, sort of all things special operations, which I think it currently is. that approach to being all things special operations, kind of the Lowe's or Home Depot of special operations, your one-stop shopping center for everything special operations, is really kind of unsustainable over the mid to long term. SOCOM cannot be, the global scouts, be the crisis response force of choice, and also be optimized for the worst case scenario. All one has to do is kind of look at the portfolio right now of everything that SOCOM is kind of the executive agent for. Terrorism outside the United States, responses to weapons of mass destruction, and the list kind of goes on and on and on. So it's really kind of worth recalling and pointing out at this point that, that the very admirable suite of capabilities that US SOCOM possessed at the end of the Cold War that have enabled American dominance in the special operations realm, we're really very much driven by very specific mission sets to be conducted by specific units under very specific conditions. And so divesting missions, giving up authorities, reprioritizing budget efforts as a result of this assessment, I think is crucial. So this leads me to the point about what SOF can do. And so by conducting such an assessment of roles and missions, and figuring out where SOF can provide the greatest utility in GPC and the most dangerous future scenarios, I think what this really kind of leads to is defining GPC in terms of special operations and its specific utility. And what this could lead to, in essence, is a US SOCOM developed kind of value proposition to the nation, to conventional forces, and to the interagency, as well as our partner and allies. And doing so is challenging and problematic. And so I think that the last and the most difficult issue for SOCOM is going to be overcoming the cultural aspect of it. And there has to be a recognition or a realization among the SOF community that its special operations are no longer the shiny penny in the policy world that they once were. And so arguably, that title, that space is now occupied by the newest service in the Department of Defense, the Space Force. And so there's a recent AEI paper that was authored by Hal Brands and Tom Nichols that really kind of highlights this uncomfortable truth for SOF, that SOF are not an unorthodox deterrent. And really the subtext of that paper is that SOF are not as strategic as they might think they are when it comes to great power competition. That special operations requirements are not the most pressing ones politically and militarily when it comes to GPC, and that the resources required for special operations aren't at the top of the list. So to connect all of those kind of strands together, it's one thing for an academic just to say, hey, SOCOM, you really should go and do this. But what I'll do is I'll offer at least a value proposition from my perspective, which is, it can be something as simple as that special operations are the economy of force option for regular threats globally, or that they are, sort of sense-making and solving wicked problems for conventional forces in great power conflict. So the first of those value propositions implies being supported when irregular threats are preeminent, and constantly sort of refining our understanding and targeting of those irregular threats in order to preempt them. But the price you pay for that one is not really contributing very much, contributing very little indeed to great power conflict, just as that second value proposition that I offered really kind of optimizes SOF for the latter, but sort of gives up some of its irregular portfolio.
Yeah. So now that the United States is arguably more focused on near peer adversaries, do you believe that the SOF role in other parts of the world is going to be diminished or perceived as less important now?
Yeah, the SOF roles may be diminished by choice, as I sort of stated previously. So it might be a choice that SOCOM and SOF make. But the real question to my mind is, perceived as less important by whom? Perceived as less important by the policy community, by the American public, by Congress, by our partners or our allies. So I would offer that realistically, I think this perception has existed for some times within the policy and departmental circles, and has influenced some of our regional partners. So some of this has to do, to my mind, with resourcing and apportionment, but some of it also reflects prevailing attitudes among operators over other parts of the world, over which parts of the world matter more. I mean, we all know that among combatant commands, not all combatant commands are created equal. Some are definitely more equal than others. So arguably, much of it has been driven by differences in the combatant commands and their relative resourcing, their prioritization, the attention that they receive, and the like. Somewhat ironically, the NSS and NDS have moved away, you know, to a degree from traditional alliances to much more transactional relationships and arrangements with partners. And the danger, unfortunately, with this is that what it might do is reinforce the perception among some of our existing and future partners that, that the United States is there when the United States needs to do something, but when those partners need something, that the United States is not necessarily going to be there. And unfortunately, there are several historical examples in which SOF was involved in Laos and elsewhere, where I won't say we cut and ran, but the perception, at least among our allies, is you were here for as long as you needed, and then when we needed you, you know, you wouldn't answer our calls.
So I'd like to take a couple more questions from our online members, and,
Sure.
and the first one is kind of near and dear to your heart and my heart in the world of education. And the question reads is, how is JPME and specifically SAS adjusting to the new GPC strategy? Are you developing new curriculum, or are there coming changes? And not only SAS, but of course, PME for the services, JSOU, we're all going to have to adapt to this. So from your perspective, what's happening in the education world?
Well, I can't speak for the entire education world, and we're all very familiar with Secretary Mattis's query that professional military education wasn't as lethal as perhaps it should be. It wasn't as optimized for a great power competition. So I won't speak for the other schools in that regard. But in terms of what SAS is doing, one of the things that that we took a look at for our curriculum is not adjusting it fully to meet whatever the policy flavor of the month is, but rather sort of looking across our curriculum and trying to figure out the ways in which we could integrate great power competition within our courses and between our courses to have a little bit of a coherent theme and narrative across the academic year. So for one example, you know, I direct 2 courses at SAS, one a military theory course and another a regular warfare course. And in the military theory course, we have some, you know, our classic body of literature that we study, but we end off that course by reading more recent works of both Russian military theory and Chinese military theory. So we read things by, we have our students read, you know, Valery Gerasimov's article along with a book by Mahmoud Gharib that came out published in English in 1998 called If War Comes Tomorrow, which really demonstrates, you know, how the Russians are trying to both understand, kind of sense make what the current character of contemporary war is, and try to figure out, you know, how they're going to modify and shape and move away from a conscript army to one that needs to be necessarily one more sort of informationally and technologically focused. We also get our students to read the Chinese sort of doctrinal document, The Science of Strategy, the 2016 translation of it. And part of the reason that we have our students read this is, you know, the Chinese have that document, which is really more of an aspirational statement, what they would like to achieve kind of between the 2021 to 2049 timeframe, when the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. By that time, what the Chinese are looking to develop is really a military that is on par with or superior to the United States, and looking at the problem sets that they're facing, and some of the challenges that they're addressing, and then to connect that to our regular warfare course, you know, what we also have is a discussion of Offer Friedman's wonderful book called Russian Hybrid Warfare, in which he looks at how the term was developed in sort of Western policy circles, and then how it's subsequently become politicized both within the Western policy community, particularly the Western European policy community, and the Russian policy community. And so it's much more of an integrative approach, as opposed to what I would hate to see is what what can tend to happen, which is, okay, we need to have a course that is designed specifically for great power competition. And so we're going to throw out a bunch of things that don't matter anymore. And this is one of the challenges of curriculum, which is, for lack of a better word, kind of blowing as the policy winds blow, and responding to that. And it's also interesting that the confusion about competition also kind of rears its head in here. There was a recent query to all the schools at Maxwell. How are you teaching great power competition? And so schools responded in a way, and the answer that came back was, yeah, you focused and provided us answers of how you're addressing the 4+1 threats, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and violent extremist organizations. Yeah, what things do you have in your curriculum that address China? Because that's, really what they were kind of looking for when they said great power competition. So again, the confusion over this is problematic for PME to adjust, and trying to take things too far in terms of modifying your curriculum to meet the flavor of the month is something that in PME you have to address both the long-term aspects of strategy and continuity of strategy, but also deal with sort of the changing contemporary character without sort of necessarily going too far in one or either direction.
Yeah. Well, you just mentioned what are you doing, what are you teaching your students in relation to China? So you just mentioned that. So I'm going to ask you another question from our online members, and it's about China. The question reads, in 1975, as Vietnam was ending, the Cambodians seized the Mayagaz, excuse me. The U.S. response was to attempt a rescue. At this point in time, China was not a significant concern as they are now. So the question is, what if that same event were to happen this year, next year, with an emergent China, or maybe an arrived China? Would we attempt a rescue in their backyard, or what would we do differently?
Well, so just by way of acknowledging some of our past greats, one of the founders of our school was flying in one of the gunships that supported the Kotang rescue operation. So we have a definite connection to some of those past incidents in special operations history. One of the biggest challenges right now is sort of limiting and managing escalation. And the tensions to a large degree are kind of high enough already. I won't say they're at a fever pitch in the South China Sea, but the Chinese are extremely sensitive and will tend to respond in a way much more reactively now than perhaps they would in the past. There is much more of an issue of humiliation and sort of trying to undertake actions that sort of offset what they call the century of humiliation that's existed, that the West has inflicted upon them. So trying to figure out, conducting a raid in that respect to do a rescue, I think would be relatively counterproductive in this current era of competition. All one has to do is look at their US reaction to the EP3 forcing down that some of you may recall. And if American citizens were, I won't say taken hostage in that respect, I think the more appropriate response would be, looking at things that we could do diplomatically or economically to resolve that, and really look at the military option as only the last choice. Absolutely.
Right. So I'd like to ask you now, does SOF or Usocom need to do anything different or improve upon to better integrate with conventional forces to ensure that the operations, activities, and actions are more aligned under this new strategy?
So it's funny you should ask that question, Kyle, because one of my hobby horses for a long time has been to try to address some prevailing attitudes that exist, and one of the prevailing attitudes that I've sort of picked up in my association with the SOF community over a period of time is really kind of to put to rest the legacy attitude that exists within the SOF community of, hey man, the conventional forces don't understand SOF and they don't understand irregular warfare and everything else. I think that attitude really served a purpose with the establishment of SOCOM, and in the early years of SOCOM as kind of the bad news bears of the Department of Defense. But really, since September 11th and over the last 15 to 20 years, conventional forces have rarely sort of said no when it comes to supporting SOF and SOF activities globally. So, I also have to caveat my statement with, I work with the conventional forces. I work for the Department of the Air Force in a Department of the Air Force school. And despite the fact that I was hired as an irregular warfare guy, I kind of look at myself as a glitch in the matrix. One of the things that I can tell you is that the conventional forces are facing some incredibly difficult problem sets when they're looking at preparing for future great power conflict, not for competition, but rather for conflict. There's an instructive line as I was thinking about this question for SOF from a John le Carré novel that I think applies here. It's relating to the master spy George Smiley, and one of his proteges says, if only you ran your wife like you ran your agents, your marriage probably would have been a lot more successful. And so what I mean in this context is, SOF can run the conventional forces in terms of liaison and understanding in the same way that SOF has really sort of so effectively worked the interagency processes for counterterrorism. So my point here is that SOF understand that SOF try to understand the issues that are inherent in the conventional forces, as well as offering to both understand the conventional problem sets a little bit better, and more importantly, offering solutions to assist. So in other words, how is it that SOF in these very challenging great power conflict sets can support conventional forces to better operate and to better accomplish their objectives? And so really, I think this point, if I haven't beaten this horse dead enough over the last kind of 50 minutes or so, is it really connects back to this cultural issue of SOF preeminence, which is really going to take some time to change bureaucratically and kind of filter its way down to the operational levels. But I think SOCOM leadership can signal this to the bureaucracy and the force. And so one of the largest impediments to changing this culture centers around budgetary fights and kind of approaching these budgetary fights in a zero-sum manner like the Trask article does. And what I mean by that is, if SOF budgets and personnel increase, then the SOF community is winning. But if they have to give up something, then somehow there's the bureaucratic perception that SOF is losing. And so I think looking at the problem set related to GPC, sort of more holistically and strategically, and less tactically and organizationally would really help in this case.
Well, I'd like to now ask you just a question about a couple of mission sets that we have in USOCOM. I mean, we understand that Special Forces and SEALs have been fighting the counter-violent extremist fight for decades now. But do you see an increasing role for other mission sets such as civil affairs and military information support operations and the SOF members that execute these missions?
Sure. So my first inclination, having been around different elements of the SOF community for a period of time, is to kind of throw a little bit more fuel on the fire and mix it up with the tribal rivalries that exist within SOF. And those tribal rivalries kind of remind me of the Afghan proverb about tribal loyalties. So for example, it's my SF group against your SF group, but then it's our SF against CA and MISO, and then when they combine those together, it's our SOF against SEALs and AFSOC, and then SOF against conventional forces. But on a more serious note, what I would say is, depending on sort of the value proposition that Special Operations Forces chooses, in addition to the time horizon and level of engagement for its activities, I think there's an increased role for both CA and MISO for changing and shaping perceptions. And what I mean by that is conducting activities that are designed to attract or induce partners and allies, as opposed to sort of soft rating, which is really more of a compellence aspect to it. So that's definitely possible. And in certain circumstances, what I might offer is that that the longer term sort of planning horizons of civil affairs in general, but internal defense and diplomacy sort of writ large could be really beneficial in kind of offsetting or competing against other great powers in the mid to long term. So as opposed to, sort of 6-month or 1 year rotations and looking at sort of problems through that lens, looking at them more through sort of the 3, 5, and even 10-year range might be useful. So the other thing that I might do is offer a variation of the question by suggesting that, what SOF might do is look more at the idea of exploring the notion of task-oriented or organized organizations that might be led by CA or MISO, depending on the problem set or outcome, and sort of perhaps running through and tabletopping how that might run.
Well, then, other than what you've already discussed, are there any other unique capabilities that Usocom or SOF can bring to this new strategy?
So, traditionally, I'd say I'd be remiss if I didn't mention special reconnaissance, unconventional warfare, FID. But I think one of the challenges here, and one of the reasons I wanted to speak about capability today, is that I think too often we in the SOF community equate role and mission with capability. And to extend that point a little bit further, we tend too often to associate capability too specifically with either individual platforms, broader roles and missions, or by extension, some units. And what I think what this leads to, unfortunately, is a level of confusion about what constitutes a unique capability. And for some organizations within the SOF community, to suggest that they have a capability as well because they support it. So, unconventional warfare, FID, CT, or the other. So the piece by General Trask and his other authors that you mentioned a little bit earlier contains some examples of this. So the authors mentioned capability in reference to special operations generation, so V capability. But they also mentioned specific mission sets, A capability, in relation to, in reference to budget cuts. And so the reason why this is important boils down to this. If you divest yourself of A capability, doesn't mean that you lose V capability. What it does is it simply changes the scope of what you consider special, or what we would consider special operations. So I would really say that what my point sort of boils down to here is to think perhaps a little more broadly about capability as a function of integration, as opposed to services, units, and platforms. And this might be helpful in confronting some of the challenges of great power competition. So linking integrated capabilities with conditions might be one way, or at least one way forward, or a helpful way to think about capabilities, reframing our understanding of it. And so let me give you an example. Long-range continentally based rating, or another might be long-term archipelagic area development and influence denial, to tie back to our issue here in discussing CA and MISO. So in some cases, framing it in this way might lead us to conclusions about pursuing some systems, pursuing perhaps others, replacing them with others, or even looking at divesting a mission entirely. So, one problem set that may be challenging that we've kind of touched on a little bit before is kind of a deep continental special reconnaissance or unconventional warfare in denied areas that are at a distance for resupply or infiltration and exfiltration. So framing capability in this way might help sharpen the focus on systems and platforms development. And so, if the characteristics or attributes of future conflicts are going to be speed, reach, and interconnectedness, and that the discussion of future conflict and future SOF capabilities should be sort of framed on that basis first, and then modified accordingly.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Professor Kairos, we're sort of approaching our time limit here, so I have time for one more question.
Sure.
And for our online members, if I did not ask your question, I sincerely apologize. But my final question for you, I want to kind of flip the role here a little bit and ask you to tell us, how are our competitors and or adversaries using special operations and GPC against us or against allies?
Sure. Well, I think that we're most familiar with the Russian examples. They're sort of the most obvious, they're the most well-known. And this includes kind of the use of SOF as little green men, as they were labeled in the press, in the Crimea and Ukraine, as well as private contractors such as the Wagner Group in Syria. And those examples are sort of already well known to this audience. Russia has used its SOF to both maintain plausible deniability for the Russian government, to complicate our situational understanding, as well as to lead and direct proxy forces in unconventional warfare using methods that are well known to anybody who's been through the Q course or the Robin Sage exercise. So they've done so also to limit their exposure and costs, as well as to limit escalation of conflict. So in other words, in a more strategic sense, what the Russians have been doing is using their SOF as an economy of force option. China's a really different and interesting case in the organization and orientation of its SOF, which is really kind of split between military, paramilitary, and internal security functions. And I would say has largely been more focused internally on combating the three evils, the primary one of which is internal dissent. I'll be honest, I know a lot more about Russian special operations than I do Chinese, but my sense is that their military SOF units are much more sort of closely aligned and tied to their conventional units, as well as their regional commands, and much less kind of on their problem sets, as opposed to sort of a much broader out of area, a global perspective than we do. So if someone in the audience would love to educate me further on how wrong I am, as my wife often does, I'm more than ready to learn. So please reach out and talk to me. But although using SOF and private military companies in the manner that I described with Russia is one form of special operations, I would suggest that where our competitors are much more engaged in thinking about special operations a lot more holistically is in their influence operations and in the most indirect manner possible. And this is through cyberspace to promulgate rumors, spread disinformation, incite conflict in Russia's case, or in the Chinese case to shape positive perceptions of the PRC. But that they really have identified kind of social and political vulnerabilities in the West and elsewhere, and have used widespread influence campaigns to shape perceptions. So, it's kind of ironic that you asked a question earlier about MISO, because really MISO is about influencing sort of tactical or local opinions. And our opponents are using special operations really at the strategic level and fairly successfully, I add, to do so. So what I would say is, while we tend to focus on military special operations, our opponents, such as Russia and China, are using them in a much more broad way as an extension of intelligence activities to considerable effect.
Well, sir, before we sign off for the day, I'd like to just offer you the opportunity to provide any closing comments to our Usocom audience.
The one thing that I would just sort of re-emphasize and highlight is the issue of thinking through and developing a value proposition. So what is it about the special operations that is going to provide value to conventional forces and the nation in the mid and long term? That's about the only thing that I would want to sort of foot stomp here at the end.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Kairos. I believe it's clear, and I think everyone believes it's clear, that the United States is moving from one era of foreign policy to another. Our recent strategy documents, which we discussed, illustrates that the primacy of counterterrorism, which dominated U.S. foreign policy for the last 2 decades, is now maybe a thing of the past. Competition with authoritarian powers is the new order of the day. So, Dr. Kairos, I want to thank you once again for sharing your time and expertise and contributing to this important conversation today.
No, again, thanks so much, Kyle and Carrie, and also thank you so much to JSOU for the opportunity to do so.
Absolutely. For our online members today, if you have any feedback on this session or any of our Think JSOU activities, or if you would like to nominate a speaker to be interviewed, please contact us at that same email, thinkjsou@socom.mil. And I'd like to close by once again encouraging everyone to explore the complete Think JSOU collection by subscribing through the library, where all these videos are loaded, also on APAN or on JSOU's social media sites on YouTube and Facebook. And always, the Usocom library is an exceptional resource for checking out electronic books or to download past and present JSOU monographs through the JSOU Press. So folks, this series is brought to you by the Department of Strategic Studies of the Joint Special Operations University, and I want to thank everyone for watching today.